In the United States, there are approximately 350,000 kids currently in the foster care system. Foster care was created to house and support children who were removed from their homes. Kids come into the system for a variety of reasons, most commonly for neglect, parents' drug abuse, and physical violence in the home. The federal and state laws protecting children in foster care have changed dramatically over the years, from zero laws protecting children to a system where every child is documented. Attitudes towards child abuse have grown and changed as well, from police refusing to take on child abuse cases to advocates for children in the foster care system being legally required. While major strides have been taken, abuse still takes place within the system, and children's needs aren't being fully met. According to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, children in the United States have the right to parental guidance, survival, development, freedom of expression and thought, privacy, education, and health care. The real question is, has the United States been providing these rights to the most vulnerable in our nation? The beginning of the American foster care system started in the 1500s with English poor laws brought with pilgrims from England. Poor homeless children were forced into indentured servitude and made to work to support themselves and their families. The burden of work in supporting the family was forced upon the children when parents couldn't support themselves. Kids unable to work due to disabilities were put into asylums. These asylums were poorly maintained and neglect was common. Children sent off to work weren't kept track of officially, meaning there was no way to report abuse or support them. In this era, people felt no responsibility to step in against child abuse. It was commonplace, and many people lived by the saying, "Spare the rod, spoil the child." If incidents of abuse were reported, they were reported under assault or battery charges, and victims had to bring charges themselves. For children, this task is nearly impossible. An overwhelming number of homeless children appeared on the East Coast during the early 1800s. This spike in numbers was due to higher immigration rates and dangerous factory work leading to kids having no parents to support them. Charles Loring Brace took quick notice of this and realized that asylums and orphanages weren't handling the problem correctly. He felt they weren't teaching young boys life skills to escape poverty and just created homeless adults. He opened and independently operated industrial schools to teach young boys usable life skills. His biggest achievement, though, were his orphan trains. Over 250,000 young boys were sent on these trains to farms in the Midwest. Orphan trains were unregulated by the U.S. government, and once kids were sent out, they were not checked on. No records were kept, so statistics on abuse, neglect, maltreatment, and working conditions aren't widely known. In 1874, Mary Ellen Wilson's case garnered mainstream media attention. The 10-year-old girl was whipped, beaten, and hit by her foster parents. This information was reported to the police by her neighbor, but they refused to work on the case. They felt it wasn't their place to intervene. There was no other formal agency to report this crime to, so it was taken to the American Society for the Protection of the Cruelty of Animals. The case went all the way to the New York Supreme Court, and minimal action was taken against her foster parents. Her neighbor ended up adopting her, and she was able to escape her abuse. There was no legal protections for children in the foster care system at this time. If bystanders had not acted, Mary's abuse would have continued. Near the end of President Theodore Roosevelt's second term in 1909, he held a conference at the White House for the Mother's Pension Movement. This was the start of welfare as we know it in America. While progress was being made, the funds for this program were only available for white widowed mothers. The progressive movement, which fought for women's rights, government services, and child services, led to a change in attitude about child abuse and the government's role in protecting children. During 1912, the foster care system became government regulated. The Children's Bureau was created in 1912 to protect children and bring their needs to government attention. Starting in 1912, states were now required by law to keep track of children in the system. This was a huge step into making the foster care system safer for children. The Great Depression, which spanned from the years 1929 to 1936, spurred a new wave of welfare services and brought poverty and government help into the forefront of the American consciousness. More funding was given to foster care, and the system expanded. Over the next 60 years, the foster care system became more federally and state regulated. In 1961, the government started paying foster parents maintenance fees for housing children. This practice, while still used today, is controversial. Some feel that people use their foster children to get free money from the government. Others feel this practice helps bring more people to become foster parents. In 1974, mandated reporting became law, and professionals, including teachers and doctors, were required to report suspected child abuse to the authorities. In 1980, the government enacted the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act because of the flood of kids entering the system during the 1970s due to mandatory reporting. Foster care has been heavily criticized for placing kids outside of their homes and families. Research starting in the 1960s has shown better outcomes with kids being placed within their family or providing resources for families before removing children. A quote from the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform, an organization who has been fighting for children to stay in their own homes for years, states, "Children left in their own homes are far less likely to become pregnant as teenagers, far less likely to wind up in juvenile justice system, and far more likely to hold a job for at least 3 months than comparably maltreated children who were placed in foster care." Stereotypes have been affecting the way foster kids are viewed and treated by society since the 1500s. Common stereotypes throughout the years include delinquent, troubled, neglected, and aggressive. In history, kids from the 1500s all the way up to the late 1800s were left on the street because they were perceived as dangerous. The church was the only resource they had. The burden of these children's situations is often put on them, seeing as they bear the consequences for their parents' actions. A person's distance from the system affects how these stereotypes influence them. A social worker who works directly with these kids and sees the hardships they've been through is more likely to see through the stereotypes. A politician or community member only sees foster kids for a limited amount of time. Their perspective is shaped by these common stereotypes. Teachers often see children's paperwork before the child themselves. These stereotypes influence the way they view children before they even meet them. These ideas affect every part of a foster child's life. I never should have been left alone in these homes, put at risk, and worn down until I felt like I didn't matter at all. No child should be. Without realizing it, I fell into denial. I walked around half empty with a forced smile on my face so everyone would be happy with me. I cried myself to sleep. I gave up hope and I could barely cope. This quote is from Leslie about her experience in foster care. She shared her story with the Children's Bureau to help spread awareness around the abuse and neglect that takes place within the system. Even though my teacher rescued me, I was still at risk. Her constant support and unconditional love over many years allowed me to shed some of my loneliness. I would not be here today if she hadn't stepped in. But what about the hundreds of thousands of foster kids who don't have a teacher willing to risk everything to help them? What do those kids get? How will they survive? In 2022, over 500,000 cases of child abuse were reported in the United States. 350,000 kids are in the system, and around 23,000 will age out each year. What history has made clear is that foster care isn't working. Kids' needs aren't being met, and the system is setting them up for failure. America has failed at protecting the rights of children in the foster care system and doesn't feel they have any responsibility to fix that. Children need advocates, whether that's teachers, social workers, foster parents, or government officials. The kids who do best in foster care have advocates making sure they get the rights they are entitled to. In local communities and in society, we need to put children's rights first. We have overlooked them, thinking it's not our responsibility, when it is.